Welcome back to the channel, coin collectors and treasure hunters. Today, we're uncovering two of the rarest and most valuable United States Washington quarter-dollar coins that could be hiding in everyday pocket change. One of these coins might be worth far more than its face value, so stay with us until the end. You won't want to miss these incredible discoveries. First coin, 1985 P Washington quarter from the Philadelphia Mint, featuring a worn surface that may look ordinary at first glance, can become surprisingly fascinating when you examine what time has done to it. The familiar portrait of George Washington dominates the obverse, but years of circulation can soften the hair, flatten the cheek, and blur the lettering around the rim. On a coin this worn, the date may be one of the first details you notice, while the small P mint mark beneath Washington confirms its Philadelphia origin. It is the kind of quarter that can disappear into a pocket, a cash drawer, or an old jar without anyone giving it a second look. The 1985 P quarter belongs to an era when Washington quarters were being produced in enormous numbers for everyday commerce, not as scarce collectibles. That fact is important because rarity cannot simply be assumed from age. Millions of ordinary examples entered circulation, and many survived decades of spending, vending machines, laundromats, parking meters, and countless transactions. Yet mass production creates another kind of intrigue. When so many coins were struck, even small differences in striking quality, preservation, or unusual minting characteristics can become interesting to collectors searching through ordinary change. Look closely at the portrait and imagine the enormous mechanical process behind it. A blank planchet was fed into a high-speed coining press, positioned between dies, and struck with tremendous force, transforming a plain piece of metal into the Washington design recognized across America. Every strike was supposed to produce a consistent result, but machinery is never perfectly immune to pressure, alignment changes, die wear, or accidental complications. That is where the collector's curiosity begins, because a normal quarter and a genuinely unusual mint-made error can look deceptively similar until the right details are examined. The worn appearance of a circulated 1985 P can actually make the investigation more challenging. A flattened rim might simply be the result of decades of circulation, while a strange-looking edge could raise questions about damage or an actual minting problem. Scratches, dents, discoloration, and machine damage can create dramatic shapes that resemble errors but have no special numismatic significance. The key is to separate what happened to the coin after it left the mint from what happened while it was being manufactured. That distinction can completely change the collector's story. Start with the weight, but do it responsibly. A genuine quarter from this era has a standard specification, and a meaningful deviation can sometimes justify closer investigation, especially when combined with other unusual characteristics. But weight alone does not prove an error. Dirt, corrosion, wear, damage, or inaccurate household scales can create misleading results. Next, study the metal color under neutral lighting. The normal copper-nickel clad appearance should not be confused with artificial tunning, chemical discoloration, polishing, or environmental damage. A dramatic color difference is interesting, but it needs evidence before it becomes a rarity claim. Then turn the coin slightly and examine the strike alignment and rim. Is the design centered normally, or does something appear genuinely shifted? Does the rim maintain a consistent shape around the entire circumference, or is there a feature that suggests an unusual striking event? A legitimate mint error can sometimes reveal itself through relationships between the design, rim, and edge that ordinary damage cannot easily explain. The most exciting discoveries are rarely based on one strange-looking spot. They come from several clues that support the same explanation. Letter doubling deserves special attention too, particularly around areas where the lettering and numbers are sharply defined. True double die characteristics are created during die production and can show distinctive separation or doubling in specific design elements. Ordinary strike movement, abrasion, machine doubling, and postment damage can imitate that appearance. This is why a magnifying glass is useful, but patience is even more important. Instead of immediately declaring a coin rare, document what you see, compare it with known examples, and remember that professional authentication is the safest way to determine whether an unusual feature is actually significant. Now comes the part that makes coin hunting so addictive: value. A normal circulated 1985 P Washington quarter generally does not become a valuable coin simply because it is from 1985, and extraordinary prices should never be treated as automatic values. But for storytelling purposes, imagine a ladder of hypothetical market outcomes where a genuinely unusual and authenticated example enters the picture. A minor but interesting variation might be discussed in an illustrative range of $2,500 to $3,500, while a much more notable and verified mint anomaly could create a hypothetical $9,000 scenario. These numbers are illustrative only, not guaranteed prices for an ordinary 1985 P quarter. Move another step up that imaginary ladder, and a high-grade or unusually preserved example could be framed around $5,000 in a hypothetical collector scenario, while an unusual mint anomaly might reach an illustrative $6,000. A rare collector piece with strong documentation could be imagined around $7,500, and an exceptionally preserved or genuinely uncommon example could reach an illustrative $8,000. None of these figures should be interpreted as a standard price guide for the date. Condition, authenticity, rarity, certification, eye appeal, provenance, and actual buyer demand would all matter enormously. At the higher end of the storytelling ladder, an unusual discovery with strong collector demand could be imagined around $8,500, while an extraordinary or historically significant example might approach $9,000 in a hypothetical outcome. That kind of money sounds less like loose change and more like a sudden windfall, perhaps enough to feel like a down payment on a home or a financial surprise that changes someone's plans overnight. But the emotional excitement should never replace careful research. A coin is valuable because collectors recognize something genuinely scarce or desirable about it, not because a dramatic number is attached to an ordinary piece. And that is why the 1985 P Washington quarter is worth examining with curiosity rather than unrealistic expectations. Hold it under good light, check the date and mint mark, inspect the surfaces without cleaning them, compare the weight against the proper specification, study the metal color, examine the rim and strike alignment, and look carefully at the lettering for legitimate doubling characteristics. Never scrape, polish, bend, or chemically clean a potentially unusual coin, because those actions can destroy evidence and reduce collector appeal. If something truly unusual survives your inspection, professional authentication can turn a mystery into a documented numismatic discovery. Perhaps the most fascinating part is that this coin does not need to look spectacular to deserve your attention. A worn quarter can carry the fingerprints of decades of American commerce, passing silently from one person to another while remaining almost invisible among ordinary change. Most 1985 P quarters are exactly that, ordinary circulated coins, but every collector understands the temptation to look one more time, because the next coin might contain a characteristic that everyone else overlooked. The real treasure hunt is not about assuming every old quarter is worth a fortune. It is about learning enough to recognize the exceptional one when it finally appears. And somewhere right now, another ordinary-looking quarter could be sitting inside a forgotten jar, an old collection, a cash drawer, or a handful of change, waiting for someone to notice the detail that separates it from millions of others. The 1985 P Washington quarter may seem familiar, but what if the next example has a feature that should never have existed? What if the edge, the rim, the lettering, or the strike tells a completely different story? Keep searching, because the next coin we uncover could be the one that turns an everyday piece of American change into a truly shocking discovery. Second coin, 1995 D Washington Quarter. At first glance, it looks like exactly what it was meant to be. An ordinary American quarter struck at the Denver Mint and released into everyday commerce during the 1990s. But hold one under a strong light and the story begins to change. The familiar portrait of George Washington dominates the obverse, surrounded by United States of America, Liberty, and In God We Trust, while the reverse carries the classic eagle design that had appeared on Washington quarters for decades. The 1995 date places this coin firmly in the final years before the state quarters era transformed the series, and that timing gives it an interesting place in modern American coin history. The small D mintmark beneath the date identifies Denver as the production facility, and in 1995, the mint was producing enormous quantities of quarters for a public that rarely stopped to think about where those coins came from. Most entered cash registers, vending machines, pockets, jars, and bank bags, becoming nearly invisible pieces of daily life. That is exactly what makes searching them so fascinating. A coin produced for ordinary circulation could experience decades of handling, while another example from the same production year might somehow escape the worst of that journey and preserve surprisingly sharp details, brighter surfaces, and cleaner fields. Look closely at the Washington portrait, and you can see how circulation changes the character of the metal. High points such as the hair, cheek, and lettering can soften first, while the open fields may develop scratches, dull patches, or tiny contact marks. On the reverse, examine the eagle, lettering, and surrounding field for unusual texture or distortion. A normal circulated 1995 D quarter is generally a common modern coin, so the excitement does not come simply from finding the date and mint mark. The real question is whether the individual coin has something unusual about its manufacture, condition, or preservation that separates it from the millions of ordinary examples. That is where the detective work begins. Start with the rim. A normal quarter should have a reasonably consistent edge and a properly formed border, but a genuine mint error can sometimes produce an unusual rim shape, weakness, spreading, or other irregularity. Then rotate the coin and compare the alignment of the obverse and reverse. Strike alignment problems can be interesting when they are clearly outside normal tolerances, but ordinary variations caused by handling or viewing angle should not automatically be labeled errors. The goal is not to find something strange at any cost. The goal is to determine whether the strange feature actually originated during the minting process. Next, examine the metal color and surfaces. The 1995 D Washington quarter is a copper-nickel clad coin, so you should expect the familiar silver-gray outer appearance. If you see an unusual exposed copper-colored area along the edge, that can deserve closer attention, but discoloration, environmental damage, polishing, or chemical exposure can create misleading appearances. Weight can also provide an important clue. A precision scale capable of measuring to at least hundredths of a gram can help identify a meaningful deviation from the expected specifications, but weight alone does not prove an error. Dirt, damage, wear, or a damaged planchet can all affect what the scale tells you. Then comes one of the most tempting discoveries for collectors: doubled lettering. Study the date, the D mint mark, Liberty, In God We Trust, and other raised design elements under magnification. True hub doubling can produce a distinct secondary contour that is part of the design itself, while machine doubling or strike-related distortion can appear flatter and less dramatic. Photographs on social media often make tiny irregularities look spectacular, but serious attribution requires careful examination. If you think you have found genuine doubling, avoid cleaning the coin, altering the surface, or trying to make the feature more visible. The original surface is part of the evidence. There is another layer to the mystery. Condition. A 1995 D quarter that spent years circulating through countless hands is a completely different collecting proposition from one that survived with exceptional preservation. Look for original luster, sharp design details, minimal contact marks, and clean fields rather than simply assuming that a shiny coin is valuable. Cleaning can actually damage collector appeal, even when the coin appears brighter afterward. A naturally preserved coin with strong surfaces can tell a far more compelling story than a heavily polished piece that has lost its original character. Now imagine the possibilities if an unusual example were properly documented and authenticated. A hypothetical storytelling ladder might begin around $2,500 to $3,500 for a particularly compelling minor variation, then climb toward $5,000 for an exceptionally high-grade example if collector demand and verified market evidence supported it. These figures are illustrative scenarios, not promises about what a 1995 D quarter is worth. In the real marketplace, value depends heavily on the exact variety or error, grade, certification, eye appeal, provenance, and what qualified buyers are actually willing to pay at a particular time. From there, the story becomes even more dramatic. An unusually significant mint anomaly could be imagined at a hypothetical $6,000 level, while a rare collector piece might enter an illustrative $7,500 range. An exceptionally preserved or genuinely uncommon example could be discussed around $8,000, and an unusual discovery attracting unusually strong collector demand might be imagined around $8,500. Again, these numbers are storytelling examples rather than established values for ordinary 1995 D quarters, and they should never be treated as guaranteed prices. The difference between an ordinary coin and a valuable one is often hidden inside details that require professional verification. At the far end of this hypothetical ladder, you could imagine an extraordinary or historically significant example approaching $9,000, but that would require an exceptional combination of rarity, authenticity, condition, and documented collector interest. A coin reaching that kind of figure would not simply be valuable because someone online declared it rare. It would need evidence. Think of the emotional difference. Discovering something like that in an old collection could feel like finding a sudden windfall, or even uncovering money that could change a family's plans, perhaps resembling a down payment on a home. But the responsible collector keeps excitement under control until the evidence is solid. That is why professional authentication matters so much. If your 1995 D quarter shows an unusual weight, strange metal appearance, dramatic doubling, an abnormal rim, or a questionable strike alignment, preserve it exactly as you found it and seek an experienced numismatist or reputable grading service. Do not clean it, scratch it, bend it, or attempt to separate the layers of the coin. Compare the suspected feature with known examples, record the weight and measurements, and photograph both sides under consistent lighting. A genuine mint error can be fascinating, but an expert's confirmation is what transforms an interesting-looking coin into a defensible numismatic discovery. And perhaps that is the most powerful thing about the 1995 D Washington quarter. Its ordinary appearance is part of the mystery. Billions of coins have passed through American commerce, yet collectors continue to find unusual pieces hiding in inherited jars, forgotten drawers, old rolls, pocket change, and collections assembled decades ago. Most will be worth only their face value, but every careful search carries the possibility of encountering something genuinely unusual. The next time a 1995 D quarter lands in your hand, don't dismiss it simply because it looks familiar. Turn it over, study the edge, check the weight, inspect the lettering, and look for the details that most people never notice. Because somewhere among the ordinary coins still moving through everyday life, there may be one that tells a completely different story. Maybe the next discovery will not have an obvious date, a spectacular appearance, or a feature that jumps out immediately. Maybe it will be a tiny minting anomaly hiding beneath years of circulation, waiting for someone patient enough to recognize it. And that is where the suspense continues. The 1995 D may only be the beginning, because the next coin could carry an error so unexpected that even experienced collectors would stop and take a second look. And when that coin finally appears, the difference between pocket change and a once-in-a-lifetime discovery could come down to one tiny detail. Third coin, 1989 D Washington quarter. At first glance, it looks like exactly what you would expect from a late 1980s pocket coin. A familiar portrait of George Washington starring left, United States of America surrounding him, Liberty above, and the date 1989 resting below. But the tiny D beneath the neck tells an important part of its story. This quarter was struck at the Denver Mint, during an era when billions of ordinary Washington quarters were moving through banks, cash registers, vending machines, and pockets across America. Its copper-nickel-clad surface was designed for durability, and most examples were destined to become nothing more than everyday change. Yet that is precisely what makes a seemingly ordinary 1989 D quarter so fascinating. The possibility is not in the basic coin itself, but in what might have happened to a particular piece during the striking process, preservation, or decades of circulation. The 1989 D quarter belongs to the classic pre-1990 era of the Washington Quarter series, when the original 1932 John Flanagan portrait remained the familiar face of American commerce. By this point, the silver era was long gone, and the quarter consisted of outer layers of copper-nickel bonded to a copper core, giving a properly struck coin its distinctive bright metallic appearance and its characteristic edge showing the copper-colored center. That construction also creates one of the first clues collectors can examine. If the edge looks dramatically different from a normal clad quarter, if the layers appear separated, or if the color seems unusually uniform from edge to edge, the coin deserves closer attention. But unusual appearance alone does not prove a mint error, because damage, environmental exposure, chemical alteration, and plating can create convincing imitations. The Denver Mint was producing enormous quantities of circulating quarters in 1989, and that production environment matters when considering rarity. A coin can have a relatively large mintage and still contain an unusual individual error, just as a massive shipment of ordinary products can contain a handful of manufacturing mistakes. That means collectors should resist the temptation to treat every 1989 D quarter as rare simply because it is old enough to feel historic. Age is not the key. The real question is whether a particular example shows something genuinely unusual, whether that feature can be connected to the minting process, and whether the coin has been preserved well enough to attract serious collector interest. Look closely at Washington's portrait and the surrounding lettering, because this is where the coin can begin to reveal its secrets. Examine Liberty, In God We Trust, the date, and especially the small D mint mark for signs of doubling, distortion, unusual shapes, or apparent separation between design elements. True double die characteristics generally show a specific form of secondary design rather than a vague shadow or blurry edge. Machine doubling can also produce flattened or shelf-like appearances that may look exciting under magnification, but usually have a different origin. The difference can be subtle, and that is why a $10 magnifying glass cannot automatically turn a strange-looking quarter into a valuable rarity. Then there is the strike itself. A normal quarter should have its major design elements properly positioned, with a reasonably consistent rim and a centered appearance. A coin with a significant off-center strike, an unusual broad strike, a dramatic clipped area, or another authentic mint-made error can become far more interesting than an ordinary example. The rim deserves special attention because it can reveal how the blank interacted with the collar during striking. If the shape looks strangely expanded, incomplete, or inconsistent in a way that appears impossible to explain through ordinary wear. Photograph it before cleaning or handling it further. A dramatic error is often easier to destroy than to discover, especially when someone tries to polish away what they believe is dirt. Weight is another powerful checkpoint, but it should be used responsibly. A normal 1989 D Washington quarter was struck on a standard clad planchet, so a scale capable of measuring to at least a tenth of a gram can provide useful information. A significant weight difference can raise questions about the planchet, missing material, an incorrect planchet, or damage, but a tiny difference does not automatically mean an error. Circulation wear, dirt, corrosion, and measurement differences can all affect the number on the scale. The smartest approach is comparison. Weigh the unusual coin alongside several ordinary quarters, inspect both edges, and document the measurements rather than jumping immediately to a spectacular conclusion. The color of the metal can also create a moment of suspense. Because the quarter is clad, its edge normally gives you a glimpse of the copper core between the outer layers, while the faces have the familiar copper-nickel appearance. A coin that looks unusually golden, gray, reddish, unusually bright, or strangely pale may seem extraordinary under certain lighting, but color alone is weak evidence. Years of circulation, exposure to chemicals, heat, cleaning, and environmental conditions can transform a coin's surface dramatically. What matters is whether the unusual color is connected to the coin's construction or minting, rather than something that happened decades later in someone's pocket, garage, collection, or backyard. Now imagine finding a 1989 D quarter with several characteristics appearing together: unusually sharp details, remarkable preservation, an apparent mint-made anomaly, and a feature that survives close examination from multiple angles. Suddenly, the coin stops being just another piece of change. This is where collector psychology enters the story. Rarity creates curiosity, condition creates competition, and a documented error can transform an ordinary date into something collectors actively want to study and own. Even then, the strongest discoveries are not based on excitement alone. They are based on evidence, comparison, attribution, and authentication. This is where the value ladder becomes interesting, but it is important to keep expectations grounded. As an illustrative storytelling range rather than a guarantee for any 1989 D quarter, a minor but genuinely desirable variation might be imagined around $2,500 to $3,500 in a hypothetical strong market scenario, while a more notable authenticated example could be discussed around $9,000. A high-grade coin might enter a hypothetical $5,000 conversation if its condition and scarcity justified serious competition. These figures are illustrative possibilities for storytelling, not standard prices for ordinary 1989 D quarters, and a normal circulated example should not be confused with an extraordinary certified rarity. Move one step higher on that hypothetical ladder. An unusual mint anomalies could be imagined around $6,000, while a particularly rare collector piece might reach a fictionalized $7,500 level. An exceptionally preserved or genuinely uncommon example could be framed around $8,000, while an unusual discovery attracting intense collector demand might enter an illustrative $8,500 scenario. At the very top, an extraordinary or historically significant example could be imagined approaching $9,000. These numbers are not promises, price guides, or claims that ordinary 1989 D quarters sell for these amounts. Actual value depends on the exact error or variety, condition, authentication, provenance, market demand, and the results of a real sale. For someone who discovers a coin like this in an old jar or forgotten collection, the emotional impact can be enormous. A few cents suddenly become a question worth investigating, and in a truly exceptional hypothetical case, the financial difference could feel like a sudden windfall or even resemble a down payment on a home. But the most valuable part of the discovery may be the story itself. The realization that something handled casually for decades might contain a detail that escaped thousands of other eyes. That is why collectors should never clean, scrape, polish, bend, or chemically treat a suspicious quarter. Preserve it exactly as found, photograph both sides and the edge, record its weight, compare it with a normal quarter, and seek an experienced numismatist or professional grading and authentication service before believing any extraordinary valuation. And that leaves the 1989 D Washington quarter with one final mystery. Somewhere among ordinary change, inherited collections, old coin jars, or forgotten boxes, there could be an example whose unusual strike, doubling, planchet characteristic, or preservation makes it far more interesting than its face value suggests. Most will remain ordinary, and that distinction is exactly what makes the search so compelling. The next time a 1989 D quarter lands in your hand, do not simply spend it without looking. Turn it over, study the rim, check the edge, inspect the lettering, compare the strike alignment, and ask one simple question. What if this one is different? Because the greatest coin discoveries do not always announce themselves with a dramatic flash of gold. They can hide quietly in everyday places, waiting for the one person who notices the detail everyone else missed, and the next coin may have an even more shocking secret.